And I want to thank the Social Histories group for inviting me, and it's nice to meet new people, new friends, and to meet a few old friends that I met after 2001. But at any rate, let me start and say that I've been highly influenced by a British historian of the 1960s, Arthur Marwick, who was a great social historian who's unfortunately deceased. And Marwick wrote a book that was published in 1998 called The Sixties Cultural Revolution in Great Britain, France, the United States, and Italy. And the title is significant because Marwick regarded the 60s Cultural Revolution as introducing or strengthening gender equality, sexual freedoms, and multiculturalism. And I'm sort of, in that cultural framework, you can also talk about the questioning of work and wage labor, because a new and radical critique of work emerged in the 1960s that recuperated the 19th century criticism of work voiced by the Luddites here, or the Free Soilers in the United States, and in France, the Proudhonistes. And what all these groups demanded was the end of wage labor. But in the 60s, that added on to this demand for the end of wage labor was also the demand for the end, more generally, of work, even including entrepreneurship. And what the most radical groups and individuals desired was a kind of cybernetic or hedonistic utopia. That is, a world where you didn't have to sacrifice. And this is summed up by an Italian author, Nanni Bellestrini, who wrote a book called Vogliamo Tutto, We Want It All, right? Which is a fiction, it's a novel, but the main character is a worker who doesn't want to work and wants everything without work. And in a kind of more sociological, academic sense, this demand for the end of work was articulated in France by Guy Debord. Guy Debord was the leader of a group called the Situationists, one of the most radical groups that emerged from the 1960s. And here, I think I'm going to try to get these images up. I'm not sure I'll succeed because we're kind of, I may have to call on Duncan here here, we'll move this over so do this. But yes, here, I even stand up. I'm not quite crippled yet, you know. Getting there. Okay, here, this is great. This is what students produced in 1968 in southern France at Bordeaux. And this was highly influenced by the Situationists. And it says the struggle against alienation has to give words their true sense. So don't say society, say racket. Don't say professor, say cops. Don't say psychologist, say cops. Don't say poet, say cops. Don't say sociologist, say cops. Don't say militants of all sorts, say cops. Don't say conscience objector. Okay, and I could go on. I want people to participate, so I don't want to go on too much. But here, don't say work, say convict labor camp. Don't say art, say how much does that cost. Don't say dialogue, say masturbation. Don't say culture, say shit gargled for a long time by idiots. And cross-reference, see professor. Don't say my sister, say my love. Don't say sir, professor, sir, say die bastard. Don't say pardon, officer, say die bastard. Don't say thank you, doctor, say die bastard. it goes on, and the end is. But I won't read the whole thing. But you can find it's pretty accessible. This little situation, this student group, I believe they were from who called themselves the Committee of Public Safety of the Vandals. All right. But anyway, so this part of this new radical critique of work that emerges from, in part, the Situationists, but there's also Herbert Marcuse in the United States, too, that articulates this to a certain extent. And what these intellectuals and others wanted was a kind of simultaneous social and personal liberation. And that's one of the powerful innovations of the 60s, that many radical people tried to combine both personal and social liberation. And in this sense, it was a real challenge to the whole Western productivist current that is so dominant in Marxism and other forms of leftism. All right. And this critique of work emerges in the 1960s when work is much less connected than it was before to production itself. In other words, people aren't artisans or peasants or farmers or even factory workers. More and more, they are in the tertiary sector, as we say, isolated from direct production at any rate. And at the same time, in the 60s, there's this baby boom. There's real demographic bulge of youth in the population. And we see this, and I'll try to advance this here. We see this in the growth of new universities. Here's one where some people argue the 60s began, or at least the radical student 60s began in France. This is a new university on the outskirts of Paris called Nanterre, out there, and so you see them constructing, what the French call terrain vague, these kind of construction sites that aren't particularly attractive. Okay, here's some more. Okay, I'll come to this in a moment. For instance, at this campus, you have in 1965, 4,600 students. Okay? In 1967, 11,000. So it more than doubles, almost triples. Okay. Now, in these new universities, there's agitation, and this is pretty 60s, over sexual segregation in the dormitories. Right? Where at that time, before 68, there's a separation between men and women that doesn't exist anymore in college dorms and university dorms, but that became a real issue across the Atlantic. So there was agitation for the end of sexual segregation. There was also agitation against any kind of selection, what it's called. That is, any kind of admission selectivity in the university system. That, in France, once you have your baccalaureate, once you have your high school degree, you can go on to the university. You have the right to attend any university. And with this great growth of the student population, the Gaullist government wanted to restrict admissions to universities, as they do, I imagine, in the UK and certainly in the United States. Okay? And this angered the students who protested over these various issues of both selectivity and sexual segregation. Sometimes the student protests would be violent, and the administration would call in the police, which further radicalized and polarized the situation. And that's what you see here. Okay, now, in the spring of 1968, it's interesting to note that the French movement is very traditional in that strikes and protests often occur in the spring. You have this protest movement culminating in something called the March 22nd movement. And the March 22nd movement, one of its leaders or agitators was Daniel Cohn-Bendit, that at that time had a very strong anarchist or libertarian orientation. And March 22nd authored a critique of work that's quite interesting. And it rejected work of any kind, and it traced the etymological origins of work to tripalium. Tripalium was a Latin instrument of torture. And it is true that in Romance languages, French, work is travail from tripalium, or in Spanish, trabajo, in Portuguese, trabajo also, and you can go on and on. So this has, you know, a root in old regime torture. Okay. Now, what happens with March 22nd is that they take over the administration building at Nanterre. The student riots at Nanterre and disruption of classes become more intense. And the dean of the university shuts down Nanterre entirely. But what that does, or what that did, was to make the movement leave Nanterre and head for Paris, the heart of the French educational system in the Sorbonne. And what happens is there's student police confrontations on the streets of Paris in the Latin Quarter, where the major French universities are in Paris, and a number of students are locked up. The confrontations continue. And students begin to occupy their universities. And when they occupy their universities, this is an interesting aspect of the movement, they invite street people, vagabonds, London proletariat. The French have all kinds of names for these groups, the trimards, the blouson noir, sort of the leather-clad, or in the Sorbonne, the catongues, named after mercenaries in Africa, the catongues. Anyway, they try to integrate these marginal groups into their own movement, and they do so successfully in some cases. There's an excellent new book about this that's come out about these people in Lyon. At any rate, these vagabonds are people who resist work, traditionally. Okay. Now, so the movement, here we are at the beginning of May, towards the middle of May in Paris, and the student movement is spreading. What this does, this state repression, and then the students will react, and the Prime Minister, Georges Pompidou at the time, said maybe this idea of sending the police into the universities is not a good one, so let's release some of the students that we've arrested. So they do that, attempting to calm the situation. But at that particular point, the Communist Party, and particularly the French trade unions, the major French trade union is a union called the CGT, Confédération Générale du Travail, and it says, we're going to call a general strike on Monday, May 13th, against state repression of the students and of the workers. Although at this particular point, the workers hadn't really entered en masse. There were several strikes during the previous week in the provinces, etc. But the National Union Organization called a one-day strike for Monday, May 13th. And that's a very important day. That is, Mondays are extremely important in the French May. Okay? It's Monday, May 13th, I just mentioned, where you have the unions call for a general strike. A week later, on Monday, the strikes become general and massive. There are various estimates of the number of strikers, between 7 and 10 million. Now, some of that is because workers just can't get to work. The trains are shut down, the subways are shut down, the bus system, etc. But others, it's, you know, they really want to go on strike. All right. It's the largest peacetime strike, and probably the largest strike in French history. And furthermore, on another Monday, May 27th, you get the rejection of a national agreement. Once these strikes become massive, the Gaullist government calls upon the unions The major trade union I mentioned, CGT, plus the second major union, the CFDT, which had sort of Catholic Christian origins, and those unions plus the major employers plus the government, they work out a deal on a national level. Right? In this situation of general strike. And they work out a deal on May 27th, a Monday, and the workers in the major metallurgical firms like Renault, which was the largest car-making factory in Europe at the time, reject the agreement. So the strikes continue after May 27th. The other thing I want to say about Monday, in connection with what Liz said, because this is the social histories group, Monday is a very interesting day, traditionally for workers, because it's not only the day that I mentioned where strikes of May 68 occur, but it's also the day called, in French, Saint Monday, Saint Lundi, where workers will continue to be absent from work and take a kind of spontaneous extension of the weekend. This is very traditional in the 19th century and continues into the 20th century, especially among women. So if we broaden our idea of class consciousness, we can include the continuation of Saint Monday. All right. Now, during this strike wave, a number of trade unionists, political radicals, and even certain groups like March 22nd, the student radicals with an anarchist orientation, they proposed workers' control, or what the French call autogestion. Right? That was their idea, that the workers should take over and run the factories themselves without management, without the owners. And my own conclusion about this demand is that autogestion, or workers' control, was a demand that came from the top down. It really didn't emerge from the workers themselves. That is, radical groups, trade unionists, articulated this demand, but the workers were uninterested in taking over their factories and controlling the means of production. For them, work remained travail, from tripalium, an instrument of torture. And I will point out, for instance, even though, here, let's see, if I can, let's try this. Oh, I see this thing is up. Here, I think it just, you'll do it quicker, and then I will. Ah, there it is. Okay, great. Okay, here I just, this situation is graffiti, never work, right? They're most popular graffiti. I just want to show you that. Let's see. Here's striking workers, right? But very few. For instance, Renault has 20,000 workers. As I say, it's probably the biggest automobile factory in Europe. Only a couple hundred actually occupy the factory. So the idea is to leave the factory, kind of escapism, as talked about. How the workers' class consciousness manifested itself, at least according to my own interpretation, is by what I call resistance to work, not wanting to work. In this case, absenteeism and striking. Okay. Now, I point this out because I mentioned Marcuse. And Herbert Marcuse, the German-American philosopher who was very important in the 60s and who also voiced some of these anti-work demands. But he said, the working class in Europe and America has been bought off. They're no longer revolutionary. That the real revolutionaries are the students, are the young people, are maybe people in the third world, but not the workers. But here we see, there's something subversive about striking, it seems to me, in this situation. So, you can't completely dismiss these strikes as a resistance to work and conclude that the workers have been integrated. On the contrary, they have not. Now, I'll add something else about the 60s. The 60s was not only a time of striking, at least in May and early June in France, but it was also a time where mass travel, inexpensive international travel, really took off with the invention of these big Boeings. Right? So people could go on trips and escape their work in that manner. It was also a time, of course, of recreational drugs, and unfortunately more than recreational drugs. So all these forms of escapism from everyday work were part of the 60s, once again trying to combine personal and social desires of liberation. And in this sense, the culture of the militants, if you recall, the situation is dismissed all militants as, I can't remember what they said, but what? Yeah, priests, political priests. That was it, right? They're all political priests. The Trotskyites, the Mao, they're all political. And you see this in the rejection of this kind of, we're going to sacrifice ourselves for the workers. You have this amongst the most radical groups in France who began to say, no, we want a utopia without work, without wage labor. All right. The sacrificial culture was rejected, the traditional sacrificial culture of all these left-wing groups. All right. Now, in this situation, I mentioned May 27th, the workers aren't going back to work, despite the agreement that trade unions and the employers and the government had signed. The government gets worried. De Gaulle says, I'm out of here. And what he does, the president of the French Republic, Charles de Gaulle, he gets in a helicopter. He doesn't tell hardly anyone that he's leaving, and he goes up to Germany, where the French have a small occupation zone, southern part of Germany, and he consults with some of his old army buddies. After all, de Gaulle was a general. And they say, if the communists, because that's what if the communists try to take over, we're behind you. That is Charles de Gaulle. Even though, there had been splits in the army over the Algerian question, when de Gaulle came to power 10 years before. And a large part of the army wanted to keep Algeria French. De Gaulle decided, because he was sure France couldn't keep Algeria, just impossible. Right? They had to fight a war for a long time, and the French wouldn't accept all those losses. So de Gaulle left Algeria in 1962. And so there are splits in it. But all these people, whether they were the people who wanted to keep Algeria French, who formed a secret terrorist organization called OAS, the Army Secret Organization, they all said to de Gaulle, we're behind you here. And in return for that, de Gaulle, in June, amnestied these former French Algerian, what we call today, terrorists. At any rate, the right comes together at the end of May in the face of these massive strikes. Here you see this right-wing demonstration, this Gaullist demonstration led by the ministers of de Gaulle, and it's massive. The right contests the left's control of the streets, which had been dramatic during early May, but by the end of May, the right begins to rally. And one of the slogans here, in addition to the French flags and the singing of the Marseillaise, is that Renault au boulot, that is, Renault, get back to work. And these manifestations, demonstrations, you'd say in English, occur throughout the major provincial cities too. So there's a real rallying of the right. Get back to work is the main platform here. All right, now, and there's some violence used to break the strike. That is, the army is called up to for instance, make sure gasoline distribution occurs regularly in the suburbs of Paris, where the oil refineries and petroleum stocks are. So there is the use of military force to break the strike. But compared to other violent events in the 60s throughout the world, for instance, in Mexico City, where hundreds of students died, this is more symbolic violence. By the way, a point made by a British cultural historian of France, Keith Reader, if you're interested, he talks about the symbolic violence of this year. At any rate, the strike gradually ends in June. The workers go back to work. They get higher pay. They get a few hours less of work per week. The work week is about 46 to 48 hours. It's cut back to 45, 46. So they embark upon a gradual reduction of work. There's some salary increase for the workers, but order is restored. Production is restored generally in France. In here, once again, I have to try to. And now I don't want to go too over my time here. Let's see, I got to go. Here's what the students come up with, the art students, and these are very well known. There's a couple of them, I just threw a few of them to you. Solidarity with the strike of the postal workers, and the students do what the situationists would call détournement. That's the symbol, the icon of the post office. So they use that to encourage the postal workers to go on strike. Here's against the strike breakers. This is one that says the strike continues, which, here, this is a very good one. Down with infernal work rhythms. There are hundreds of these things done by art students throughout France, mostly in Paris. And you see the kind of stereotypic image of the capitalist, fat, smoking a cigar. But here we have the clock, right? I guess, no, that's it. All right. But so, of course, the workers go back to work. And, let me just say a couple things. I don't want to, once again, go over time. But the 60s saw, in connection with the workers, one of the major themes of this audience, they saw the birth of a new labor history. In these Western countries, that is, you have, for instance, E.P. Thompson here, although he's not as, in my mind, as quite as innovative as, for instance, a French labor historian, Michel Perrault. Michel Perrault had great volumes, several volumes, what the French do, called Thèse d'État, on 19th century workers' movement. She's very interested in these phenomena such as absenteeism, sabotage, lateness, drunkenness at work, indifference, faking illnesses. So this is a kind of new opening up the everyday life of workers, and once again the refusal of work. You also have the very well-known work of Michel Foucault, who questions the role of the prison, questions the productivism that exists in Western societies. So you have new ideas circulate here. So let me conclude, though, about this French experience. As I mentioned, gradually the work week is reduced after 1968. Union membership hits its high point in 1969. About 25% of the workers are unionized in France in 1969. From there, it's descending. But in the long term, what happens after 68 is that there's the end of full employment. Right? 68, anyone could get a job. This encouraged amongst the workers turnover, or even amongst students. Easy to find a job, easy to leave a job, easy to find another one. That ends. Right? The abundance of wage labor that existed in the prosperous 1960 terminates. And this is part of the counter-revolution. Going back, if I can go back to the counter-revolution, which persists after 1968 in the form here of Thatcher, right? Who praises work, right? Goes back to that 19th century Victorian tradition, or in the United States it's Reagan, or more recently in France it's the former president of the French Republic, Nicolas Sarkozy, who said during his successful election campaign, I am going to fight for the people who se lèvent tôt, who get up early and go to work. Okay? So that's part of this triumph of the work ideology. Although, it's still contested, right? Although, the anti-work movements of the 60s were not quite as successful in changing Western culture, as were movements for gender equality or sexual freedoms or multiculturalism. Right? But there's a pushback even today against those too, as you're well aware. At any rate, I'll end there, and I await your response.